Hello, I'm Brad Kelly, and you're listening to Method and Madness. This is a show about books, the people who write them, and the labyrinth to be explored between the words.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had his band. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had.
Audrey Lee is the author of the short story collection Utter Goodness, out now on Farthest Heaven. Go get that. There will be a link to that in the show notes. I definitely recommend it. And, while you're there, get another couple of Farthest Heaven books. They're like I think for 2026, one thing is Farthest Heaven is in, but we'll talk more about that. Audrey Lee is also the writer of a whole bunch of great essays you can find on her Substack, Audrey's America. We're going to talk about a couple of those maybe. Audrey, it's really nice to meet you. Thank you for taking the time on this Sunday morning. You could have been snuggled up on the couch, or you could have been making a snowman. I don't know what the weather's like where you're at, but I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me for a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brad. Thanks for having me on. It is deceptively warm outside right now, so no snowmen here in Philadelphia. It's 45 degrees for some reason in the middle of January, but we'll take it. I'm running after this, as you can't tell. So There we go.
Perfect. So first area I want to talk about is this new book, your wonderful book, Utter Goodness. Let me just quickly, for people, kind of set the table, and then I'm just going to quote the sort of promo text because I think it's actually really well done. And if I'll stumble over trying to introduce it and go off on tangents. But this is what it's about. 13 short stories spanning the country from East Coast to West, from New York City to backwater counties, await you in Utter Goodness. Beasts, birds. We almost forgot birds. Murder, muscles, Soviets, and swans sing in chorus. Audrey Lee's characters face religion, love, and judgment in every state of the nation and in every state of grace. I think that's pretty spot on for, what readers can expect. I enjoyed its humor and its precision, its heart. You do in this book what, in my opinion anyway, is what the best of literary short fiction does, and that's to create these moments. Moments of humor, anxiety, pathos, love, uncertainty, whatever. And you create these moments in a way that is both novel and particular, but also familiar and universal. So just first of all, I guess just kudos to you on this book. People should go get it. It is out now. Anybody else, anybody out there who needs a new short story collection and wants the new hot thing, this is it.
It's Utter Goodness.
Yeah, there you go.
I have been trying so hard not to make puns about Utter Goodness as a title, but it's so easy to,
Sure.
It's really good, so on and so forth.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for that introduction.
Absolutely. I guess, one thing that's notable in this book is this geographical span of it, at least within the United States. And I take, in reading this, I couldn't help, but I guess backing up a second, I just started with the first story, and as I'm kind of working through them, somewhere in the second story, I was like, okay, I kind of get Audrey's setting. I get her, where she places things. And then the next story is on the other side of the country. It's like, oh, okay, this is actually, and then by the time as we move through it, I realize it's almost like we're taking random samplings of America to a certain degree, kind of all over the map. In all kinds of different social contexts. I guess I wanted to kind of start here, and this is a little bit biographical about you. What is your experience of America? Have you lived a bunch of places? Have you traveled quite a bit? I guarantee you've traveled quite a bit within the United States, but I want to hear something about that.
Yeah, so definitely more the latter. I've traveled more. I grew up outside. Pretty much most of my life has actually centered around Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. I grew up outside of the city. I went to school an hour and a half away in the most Amish county in the United States, Lancaster. And then I moved back to Philly after I lived in Utah for a little bit. So that was my COVID hiatus, if you will. Cool. So most of my living life, save for the Utah hiatus, has centered around living in and around Philadelphia. But I have traveled a lot. When I was a kid, my parents were really big on like going different places in the United States. So we were a really big like national park family, especially going out west. I'm a skier, so I traveled quite a bit to go skiing, which was fantastic. And then in my adult life, I used to travel could be a super commuter. So I'd commute to New York for work from Philly. So I think that, and that was, it's just two different cities, one up to the other. And also I am, as may have been evident, I actually don't post about it that much right now just because I haven't been on a train trip in a year. But I, for the past 3 years, have done these cross-country train trips where I am just on Amtrak for like 9 days straight. My like small side interest is I'm really into train travel. And that has been basically like 3 years ago, it was February in Philadelphia. The Eagles had just lost the Super Bowl. I'm feeling stuck. And I was like, I need to go somewhere. Like, what am I going to do? And Amtrak at the time had a sale on this USA Rail Pass. It's like 10 tickets. It was like $350. And I was like, well, I can do that. I'm like a broke kid just out of college, but I can spare that to do wherever the hell I'm going to go. And I did. And I just went across the country and back. So Philly, San Francisco, couple other places in between. And I've done that twice now. And so that's been a really good way to like, again, see the country. Also I call it like a writing residency on rails. So I just write all the time. But that being said, I've done a lot of cross country drives and stuff. So I have definitely seen a lot of the country. I'm very blessed to have been able to travel quite a bit. Whether out of, tourism or just pure necessity, getting from one place to another. Living in Utah, I had to drive back and forth and back and forth. I'm very familiar with that I-80 route. So I think that it's been, throughout my life, I've always taken to place. And I always kind of want to get to the bottom of what a place is. I actually, a side tangent in writing stories, there are a few stories in the collection, Engineer being one of them, that do take place in Philadelphia, but I am notoriously bad / don't like writing about like places I've lived thoroughly in my normal life. So very few of my pieces actually end up centering around Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. Because I just don't have as much of an interest writing about personal experiences or where I live. I feel like every time I try and write something with that, I start like over intellectualizing that. I am very much like, I know way too much about this place almost, and I have to get it all out, and that doesn't really work. Versus when I write a lot of these other stories, I am like, if I stop in one city for a night, I have no idea what that city's like. I have no idea what it's like to live there. I am but a person passing through many such cases. But I often am just like overwhelmed by what's going on there. And, a lot of the cities that I've written about are places that I am just like, I want to figure out what's going on here. And so in my research for like writing about places, it's either like places I've been. A couple of them I haven't been. Like I've never been to Galveston, Texas, which is in Oysters by the Dozen. But when I'm doing research, I'm like on Google Maps, I'm like, where's this gas station? Where's this hotel? Where's this restaurant? So that's really a fun part of both travel and then like when I'm writing about different places, this getting to the bottom of who's there, what's going on, and literally to a physical extent, what is there. So.
Right. Google Maps is an interesting, I've ended up using that quite a bit in researching stories and stuff. But yeah, you get aerials and you can do the street view sometimes and kind of just walk around. And it's obviously not the same as being there, but it does help to provide you some like at your fingertips context and stuff like that.
I spoke about this on, I recorded an episode of Victim Radio with Emily Sapora, but when I did spend time in Iowa City, when I was like just out of high school, I was doing a pre-college writing program there. And one of the moments from the story, Goodbye Burger City, where the main character is, the narrator is buying like blue raspberry four Loko. You know, she's buying like a slushie and some beer, like a 40 at this gas station in Iowa City. That gas station did exist, and I had been there. And I had underage purchased some blue raspberry four Loko at the time because I was like 18.
Nice.
And then I was looking stuff up when I was writing that story, and it turns out they bulldozed it to build like condominiums. And I was like, oh my gosh, rest in peace to that one come and go gas station where I didn't get carded buying blue raspberry four Loko, which couldn't have been more obvious. So
right. Oh, that's a lot. That's awesome.
this is like almost 10 years ago at this point, but I was like, oh my gosh, sending up prayers for that specific come and go gas station.
It is funny how places like that can develop a sort of sentimentality to like individual to you, right? Because to anybody else, I mean, there's a million of those places, right?
Yeah. It is very sentimental, and I think one of the reasons I write a lot about places because especially places I've been, I have a lot of these little nitpicky stories in them like that, and that somewhat translates to these different moments in short stories as well.
Yeah. I have a sort of similarly, I don't even know if similarly, but what came to mind, there's a rest stop in Nebraska that I've ended up at on 3 different occasions completely with no intention of like I'm going to that one, just sort of ended up there on cross country trips, and I greyhounded around a lot at one point. And that place has got this weird in my head, it feels like every time I've been there that there's no intervening time. Suddenly everything is very like sort of warped in my head, and it's just this sort of interdimensional space that I can occupy.
The liminal space of like my place in Nebraska for that is Kearney, Nebraska.
Okay.
Which is basically the entire thing is like, hotels, and it's a place on I-80. So just truckers are stopping there, and I have stopped there way too many times for someone that does not live in Nebraska to like rest up before continuing a drive. And I remember I was on a train as well. At one point I was talking to these 2 women who were from Nebraska. I was like, oh yeah, I've stopped in, I think I was pronouncing it Kearney at that point. And they immediately go, oh, it's Kearney. It's Kearney, Nebraska. I am like, I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh. Okay. Good to know it's Kearney, Nebraska.
Yeah, well, no, that's fascinating. There is this thing, and I've noticed this. I've lived a bunch of places and traveled around similar to you, and there is this thing that every place has its own geographic shibboleth, and it's some name for a place or a street or a neighborhood or whatever that only people who live there know it, how to pronounce it. And it's almost like a test to see whether you're inside or outside, right? And like we have a bunch of them here, and it's funny because there's this French influence in the Detroit area where I am, except nobody can speak French at all, and so we have these like the city Detroit is Detroit or something in French, right? And we have streets like Gratiot, but the way it's spelled, people say Gratiot. And Google Maps is always screwing these up. It's always saying them in very, humorous ways. But those are our tests to see if you're a Detroiter or not. Yeah.
I imagine that, well, when I was I have 2 things to say. Because one, I live in Philadelphia. And this is a city that isn't, your like entire clout is entirely dependent on how you pronounce things. So like we have there's actually a bit where like if I saw this Instagram reel once, and it was like minor league hockey players who had just come to Philadelphia trying to pronounce like local things. So there's like if I tell you the name Schuylkill River, you will have no idea how to spell it, because what it looks like, it doesn't look like Schuylkill, but it's pronounced Schuylkill. I live off of East Passyunk. There's no H in Passyunk. There's like, what is it? Oh my God, out in the suburbs, there's a lot of Welsh influence. So Bryn Mawr, Ballackinwood. If you ask anyone who just came here, like, oh, Ballackinwood, they'd be like, Ballasignwide? Like, so this city is so much of that, like trying to, a lot, if people come here and they're like, oh yeah, I live in, oh my God, I live in, I'm not even sure what neighborhood I'm going to go for here. Manayunk. And you're like, no, that's Manayunk. Or like Conshohocken's another one. That's one that people look at and just like their brain glitches. I was in Detroit a couple of years ago and I will say I'm not a techno person, but I went to a techno festival with friends for
I used to go to that all the time.
Movement for just the anthem. You look like the kind of guy who I would see at Movement.
Sure,
I was like, I'm going, not derogatory here.
It's fine. I don't go anymore because I'm an old man and I can't stay up that late, but like, yeah, that used to be my annual thing. Yeah.
I was like, I'm going through the anthropological experience of seeing what a techno festival in Detroit is all about. And I got that anthropological experience. But my whole bit the entire time, which was just such a stupid bit, was me going, Detroit, Detroit. And it's like, yeah, that is like French. That's how it's pronounced. Shockingly, I was really impressed by Detroit, mostly because as someone from the East Coast and, you know, I'm 27, so my childhood idea of Detroit was just after 2008. And like, you know, my dad telling me about like, there's feral dogs running around Detroit, which I'm sure there are and were.
Yeah.
And was really impressed, obviously, when I got there, somewhat because that was my first impression, but also I was like, I think the city's had, you know, it's somewhat Philadelphia-esque in that it had a very bad part and now it's getting better as far as I can understand.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. It used to be that within the city of Detroit there were no sort of there were very, very few areas in which somebody from outside the city should probably go. And now there are territories sort of opening up where you can go and have a perfectly safe, fun time and go to cool shows and eat at good restaurants and all of that. But there are still feral dogs.
Yes. There's feral dogs here too, but there's just not in the same reputation, if you will. I will say out of my NFL teams, beyond the Eagles, fan of your Detroit Lions as well. Good. So there you go.
Very cool. Very cool. On this sort of topic, thinking about traveling in America, what is something about America to you that the European mind cannot comprehend?
Oh my gosh. I feel like that's actually such a great question. I feel like Americans have a shamelessness that the Europeans do not understand, cannot comprehend. And I'm not necessarily saying that in a positive way. Like, I'm one of those people like, yeah, we should have a little shame sometimes. I have this very like waspy ilk where I'm like, you shouldn't say that or do that, or, you know, let's not talk about that sort of a thing. But it's which is a different instance than the Europeans, because I think Europeans have this very, you know, and to some extent they are a monoculture much more than the US is, country to country. And so they have different standards. So they, I think, look down, obviously Europeans are like, I'm going to do some horrible French accent. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. But, you know, there's a lot of this like reputation of the very trashy American. Why are they like this? They buy big cars, which of course is such a stereotypical view of Americans. And also, not a lot of the things I think Europeans put together as American do not exist in like just one American. Like there's so many different things. And so I think that Americans have a sense of shamelessness, in many different aspects. Like you have the very gaudy nouveau riche side of things, I think down in like Miami, for instance, or you have, I don't want to use the term like redneck, but like a lot of American media centers around that. And something that I do admire about like extremely like middle America is that, people don't have a lot of shame and they're kind of just proud of it, which I think it's better to own it and be like, hey, we're like this rather than to not. And so I think Americans have that sense of like honesty but lack of shame at the same time. They're honest about their lack of shame that Europeans can't comprehend at all. And quite frankly, a lot of people are like, that's ugly, that's trashy. And I'm sort of like, the country would not work without that at all.
Right.
I think people should have social decorum. I am a big fan of the social contract. And, I think antisocial behavior is just horrifying and like has been detrimental, especially living in a city, like across all aspects, especially since COVID. But at the same time, if there's not really a situation because America is just geographically so divided and so culturally different between those locations, and not as much of a monoculture, that if we removed a lot of those more shameless aspects, things just wouldn't work. That's just not possible. And I think there's a very strong difference between like antisocial behavior and like, you know, some guy being really proud that he just shotgunned a bunch of beers or something. So, that's something where I'm like, that is something the European mind absolutely cannot comprehend. It's something that I'm definitely interested in writing about. I think I always reference like Oysters by the Dozen, or like American Girlfriend, and again, these very gaudy, showy, glittery characters who have who want you to know that they are wealthy and have absolutely no shame in, you know, again, in the more waspy sense of let's be tasteful, let's be like, you know, humble and honest. And they're like, I'm buying a $30 million mansion in Carmel, Indiana, and it's going to look awful. And I'm going to love it. So that's like, or I'm going to have a rhinestone studded like cowboy hat. Like that's fantastic to me. And that's a lot of what I think appears in my writing is like just that shamelessness and fascination with it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly why I asked this question, because I felt like there were these burblings all throughout the book of like things that I was thinking, if I was a European and I'd never been to the United States, would I understand? Like how, to what, I shouldn't say would I understand, to what degree would I understand this?
Yeah.
Right? Like how, would it feel like a caricature, or would this feel like an instance of something I might actually run into? Because I don't think, you do have these gaudy kind of outlandish characters, but nothing in Utter Goodness feels to me like a caricature exactly. Like these all feel like certainly possible circumstances that you can find people, and some of them are like, oh yeah, I think I saw that happen actually, like very, you know, in particular, I love a bunch of these stories, and it's kind of hard to talk about a short story collection because they're all so different. One of my favorite stories is Goodbye Burger City, and partially because, I mean, when I was a kid, I worked in fast food, and I probably come from a very similar sort of strata of society as those characters do. So that's all a lot of that is very familiar to me. Just the attitudes and there's a sort of like no perception of like the future kind of aspect to it. It's just the ever present now is sort of happening to these people. I guess, you know, I want to get in to a little bit more specifics on a couple stories, and maybe we can start with Goodbye Burger City. And a lot of writers listen to this show, so I always like to do a little bit of kind of writer craft shop talky kind of stuff. And I like to ask this question: when it comes to that story, and maybe if you can't remember, maybe we can jump to another one, but what was sort of the first thing that came to mind for that story? Like, you know, before you had anything, what was the first thing you wrote down someplace that ended up being in that story?
Yeah, so this is actually a really good story to go off on, because I think this is a great example of where I can pull an idea from it and how many forms it goes through before it becomes like a concrete story. So in 2018, it was summer 2019, I think, before the pandemic, I stayed at college that summer, and Lancaster has a lot of churches, and I was driving around, and it was so hot. It was like the hottest weekend of the summer. I went to New York for some reason that weekend and came back, and it was like 120 degrees. It was awful. And I remember driving in one of the churches, had this marquee. I love seeing church marquees and seeing marquees that get crazy with it. And it was I think I used this in the story. It was just, you think this is hot. Obviously insinuating hell is hotter. And I was like, that's so good. That's like a fantastic example of like an evangelical church marquee. And so I had that idea in my head for a while, like church marquees. And this idea of this character Annie driving by, and there's all these, you know, either just more docile Bible quotes, you think this is hot? And that was something that I tinkered with for a while before this became Goodbye Burger City. I think I had written several, and a lot of my short stories, they start in different forms, and I kind of workshop those ideas, which is entirely based on, is this working? Is this not? Can I save this, whatever I've written to transfer it into another story later? And so that story certainly started with the church marquees. And I think that went through 3 or 4 years. I think it was 2019 to I worked on this one in 2023 more, was when I really started to develop this idea. And I used the church marquees in some different poems. I used it in some other different stories that never saw the light of day. And then it finally made it into Goodbye Burger City. And that was one where I just had this idea of this girl like driving around, again, very I wanted to connect it back to my time in Iowa City, specifically that Come and Go gas station. And that felt like a good way to do that. And so that was where that one started in particular. I've talked about some of my other places I pull from, and it's always something like that. It's always me being like, that's brilliant. How do I work that into a story?
Yeah. No, I this is kind of why I asked this question, because I always love the answers to it, and there's always a sort of a familiarity to it. And for me too, and other writers I've talked to on this show, it's often just something really small, and it's almost like, the way I think about it, it's like something that just kind of catches your eye, and when you look at it, you still don't even know what it is yet. It's like, I'm just going to keep, I sometimes feel like I'm a little raccoon. It's just like, I'm going to take this thing, I'm going to put it in my little nest, and at some point it's going to make sense, or I'm going to set it next to something and the color will be right or whatever. Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating process.
It is like interior design. Like you got to, and I say this because I just moved, so I'm figuring out what the hell to do with my living room. But you have this weird lamp, this weird piece, and you got to figure out how to work it in, but you're not sure what pieces are going to go with it yet. And sometimes it takes years to figure that out. And a lot of those ideas I hold on to for a really long time and workshop them in different ways. And then, we got a good rug. That'll work. Let's put that together. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you about, this is a question related to another story, one of my other favorite stories in here. What's up with bodybuilding? Tell me about it. What was like, I need to write a story about bodybuilding in some way?
Oh my God. Okay, this one's gonna be so I am obviously very on Twitter, and you probably see where this is going from this first comment.
Maybe.
And me and my friend, two of my friends, had this ongoing bit for a while about specifically a Bronze Age pervert tweet that uses the phrase Hawaiian style. I'm not going to read this tweet out loud. And you can go search it on your own time. And the story has eventually nothing to do with Hawaiian style. And I'm not going to explain what that is either. But I was like, it was such a funny, I do like, I like Bronze Age perverts Twitter because it's hilarious. And just the image of what was going on in that tweet, I was like, that's insane. And I am somewhat fascinated by bodybuilders. One, because of this, and at the time too, I also watched a really good documentary, I think it was just like on like Netflix or something, really bored. I don't remember if it was Netflix in particular, but it was early 2000s documentary about like anabolic steroids in bodybuilding and like the pros of them and the sacrifices. And it was really good because I don't think it took a explicitly like, it was a really nuanced documentary in that it wasn't necessarily like a PSA against anabolic steroids. But it wasn't obviously for. The whole point being like, if you are on your quest to perfection and if you are going to make money off of your bodybuilding, off of your, wrestling, so on and so forth, this ends up being what you have to put yourself through. It just great sacrifice, obviously. And I don't think in sports you get, I was an athlete through high school in particular, and I still I'm still a runner. And there's a lot of, and I went to a sports high school, and there's a lot of sacrifice that people would put themselves through to be a great athlete. And I went to school with people who ended up going into professional sports. I was an average athlete, swim team. It worked. I was the 500 swimmer. Right. But there's just, I don't think the average person knows what athletes will put themselves through in their path to greatness, if you will. And I also don't think that a lot of athletes themselves know what they're putting themselves through. And bodybuilding is a more extreme example. One, because it's not necessarily a sport, but there is that competition aspect of it. and two, because it's one of those things that really is not totally condoning performance enhancing drugs. In fact, actively encourages it at most points. As much as anabolic steroids have been obviously outlawed. And so that was this whole thing of like, I really like that documentary, and I can't remember the title of it. I'll send it to you later, because it took that really good approach where it wasn't an anti-drug PSA, but it wasn't an endorsement of like, you know, look how great these guys are after they shoot themselves up with steroids and they like, you know, kill their wives or something. Right. And so that's where that story started, was somewhere in a cross between a Bronze Age pervert tweet and this fascination with bodybuilders. And I really think that like Arnold Schwarzenegger era of bodybuilding and every, you know, Gold's Gym, everyone's tan, everyone's got, you know, like 5 girls in bikinis around him. It's so, again, that gaudy, just sort of guys having a good time, fascinating thing. And I really liked that. At the same time, I'd also read something about National Lampoon's magazine, which was, you know, another comedy magazine of the Mad Mag era that obviously put out, turned into a movie franchise of my favorite movie ever, which is Christmas Vacation.
Oh, it's great.
I've seen that like 50 times. I don't know. I love Chevy Chase. But I really like, I love this boys club whole sort of a thing where it's like this magazine and in this golden era of New York in that early to mid 90s period. And then also on the other end of like a boys club, like bodybuilding, which is so hyper masculine. And I'm very pro this, I will say. This is not a condemnation of these like places and spaces and men. I'm so like, hell yeah. Like, let's go. You guys have fun. But yeah, so it started out as a Bronze Age pervert tweet. I watched a documentary on bodybuilding and it turned itself into Men's Unlimited and this Men's Interest magazine, this utter dweeb. And I really like the idea of this insecure, utter dweeb. He's insecure in his own home. He's insecure in his job. He goes and interviews the second strongest man in the world. And he's like, this guy's going to kill me. Like, so that was sort of I always try and loop in something vaguely humorous, as absurd as it is. And that was that moment where I was like, I think people understand what bodybuilding is, but what happens when you throw a guy with no upper body strength and a blue blazer in the room?
Right.
This was my opportunity for that.
No, I love that. I love that dynamic between them, and I mean, it just makes Cliff Gonzo even sort of more exaggerated in relief,
yes.
Right? He becomes, I'm sort of interested, I think, in the bodybuilding world in a similar way that you are. There's this thing where it's like, it's almost you said it wasn't a sport, and that's totally true, but it's almost like how to say this exactly. It's like if you mutated sports and pushed it as far as you could get, it becomes just that. It becomes just like this intense body modification, essentially.
It's all about physical perfection and the limits of what the human body can be and what it can do. But in this case, without being left up to the chance of sports almost. It's totally in control. Like bodybuilders are totally in control of their bodies and what they can do. They may not be totally in control of their rage, especially on anabolic steroids, but they are, and that control, I think, is also a very, American read of it, where it's the aesthetics of it. It's being totally in control of themselves, and what they can mutate and shape their bodies to do. Yeah,
and there's also the thing, especially in like the 90s when it fit in a different place in culture than it does now, I think, in the 90s. And because Arnold Schwarzenegger is part of that, I think, you had the movie star who was also at the kind of the peak of that. But the interesting thing about the sort of the party atmosphere that it was shown as is this like exaggerated hedonistic masculinity is those guys who are sort of getting their pictures taken off camera. They're like counting up white meat chicken ounces. You know what I mean? They're like, they're not like living that. Yeah.
I love the biohackers now too. I think biohackers are in some way and like this modern day extrapolation of that. Brian Johnson obviously is someone I have to name here. I love Brian Johnson. A lot of people are like, this guy has no soul. I'm like, this is the most ensouled man I've ever seen in my life.
My opinion is changing on him towards that.
Yeah. I think
at
because
first it was just like it's just it's gross almost. But then,
Yeah.
yeah.
And he's done some weird things, obviously, but he's someone that, again, has taken total control of, taken the ultimate, or trying, should I say, to take the ultimate control of fate, which is death. And that becomes his whole thing. And I find that almost like the natural consequence of, bodybuilding doesn't have that same place. WWE, I would say, still does, and there's obviously overlap there. I was recently introduced to the concept of Ric Flair. And side tangent, Tom Will, who's another Farthest Heaven writer, mentioned Ric Flair, and I was posting about it with him and Bill Ballard, the editor-in-chief. And so I was like, oh, let's watch some Ric Flair intros on YouTube.
Awesome.
And and I guess the only reason this could happen is because the type of person who usually watches Ric Flair videos, my entire algorithm became Ric Flair intros and Taliban videos. And I'm not kidding. It was video after video of Americans, it was of the Taliban, and then of the American soldiers, the Air Force going in and bombing some Taliban compound. I was like, wow, never watched these before in my life, but time to figure out what we were doing in Iraq.
Right.
So that was, or Afghanistan. So that was, in a way, awesome, but I was also like, wow, this is exactly what I would imagine. I guess algorithmically, that was the only way I could think of why the internet would start showing me Taliban videos. It was the type of person who watches Ric Flair intros probably also really likes us just murking some, sand in Afghanistan. So
yeah, no, that's a really interesting sort of way to get some kind of peek under the hood of the algorithm, right? It's what is the other thing that starts popping up now that I watch this video? I got obsessed with, there's all these public domain YouTubers who sort of take public domain videos of interrogations where they're interrogating criminals. And this is partially started as a writing research thing. I was like, I don't really know what an interrogation actually looks like. I just know what they look like on TV. So let me start watching some of these, and they're fascinating, right? People come in and they're trying to get away with it, and by the end they're crying and confessing. It's kind of a fascinating process they go through. But then what started showing up at the same time for some reason is this Los Angeles, I guess he's a rapper. This guy Lefty Gunplay started showing up.
No idea.
And he's just the most drugged out, head to toe tattoos. His music, in my opinion, sorry for Lefty Gunplay fans out there, terrible. And his interviews, he's just incredibly high, rambling. And I don't know how the two came to get anyway, but that was my instance of what you're talking about. I was like, how are these two things the same somehow? Am I missing the connective tissue?
My only connective tissue there was maybe the type of person who's a Lefty Gunplay fan is also the type of person who wants to know what not to do in a police confession.
Yeah, exactly.
That's my only idea of I really like Lefty Gunplay, and there is a chance that I could be in this hot seat with a cop interrogator. What do I not do? So.
Right. No, I think you're right. I think you nailed it.
Maybe we should. I'm like, I should send that to the Philly FBI local office. Maybe they could benefit from that. Tactic. There was this whole side tangent again. There was this whole Reddit page in Philly called Philly Wiki, which was very much for the criminal underground, if you will, of Philly, but it wasn't really underground because it was this huge Philly Wikipedia. And there was also one called, I think it was Philly Scoreboard, where basically guys who, there's obviously a lot of gang violence here. So it was guys putting up, hey, just mark to this guy, sort of a thing. And, it was a scoreboard basically of who had killed the most people.
That's
and it was
crazy.
a public Reddit page.
Wow.
And I wondered, and that one got taken down, obviously, but I kind of wondered at the time, does law enforcement know this exists and that it could be an extremely useful tool to get literally anyone in this realm? But that's besides the case.
Seems like if they were doing their job, they would know about it, right? I mean,
right?
They would if I were in the law enforcement, I might want to keep it up. Keep that
right?
up.
Exactly. They'll just keep posting. No one's stopping them. So Larry Krasser, is it? But we so that was but the algorithm too, again, is it unveils a lot. I like the idea of doing YouTube for writing research too, and your interrogation thing I used. I was working on a story that didn't make the cut for Utter Goodness because I'm still kind of workshopping through it, but about fracking. And fracking is a fascinating thing to me. When I was a kid, was when like Halliburton was putting a lot of money into fracking the Marcellus Shale up in northeastern Pennsylvania. Northeastern NEPA famously is like very downturned because it was a coal. The entire region is full of coal, anthracite coal. And then obviously once there was no more coal, or that wasn't being used for electricity, just towns completely collapsed. Centralia is a really good thing to look up here, which was a coal mine that caught on fire and it's still burning, and the entire town's been like evacuated.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've read about that. Is interesting.
It's crazy, but fracking in particular, I was like, well, now I got to figure out how like living on a fracking site works. Because especially out in like North Dakota and stuff, fracking, it's like you go out for a couple. If you're a guy, you go out for a couple weeks and you live at this man camp and you frack the hell out of the land and you set up the rig and then you leave and the rig just pumps out the natural gas. And so this story took place in one of those man camps, and so I watched like a ton of videos about like how a fracking rig works, and two, like, what is that life like? There's not a lot of resources on that. And DuckDuckGo, I will say, became a very helpful tool for that. Because if I Googled anything, like, it was a lot about anti-fracking stuff, and then DuckDuckGo was like, here are these legal documents about how fracking works. And I was like, awesome, thanks.
Right.
So.
Yeah, you gotta sometimes get underneath the bias, right? Because
I will say, as someone that does SEO, Google has those biases, but it was, that's an example too of like, if I have to research something, if I have to research a place or like, again, an industry here, YouTube, obviously a fantastic tool for that as well.
Yeah. What story in this collection would you say required the most of that kind of effort of research? Would you say? Because there's such a diverse set here. I mean, yeah.
I would say, oh my gosh, and I'm thinking through here, probably a tie between Oysters by the Dozen and American Girlfriend. And there's a reason that there's a tie. One is because I haven't spent that much time in Texas. But Texas is a fascinating place to me. I've only been through, I did a train trip, of course, and I had to go through San Antonio, Fort Worth, and Dallas. And when I was a lot younger in high school, I was a big fan of the Mountain Goats, as like one is when you're like 16. No offense to Mountain Goats fans, but they had the best ever death metal band out of Denton was a song I really liked, and so I had this all day to do Denton. I obviously had, just because I hadn't been there, I had to do a lot of research about Galveston and High Island, and that was a Google Maps trip for sure. And that story was also one that I wrote about this on my Substack, was originally based off of this cowboy mafia, which was the first group to be hit with RICO charges once the RICO Act was enacted. And so the character of the Baron is based off, who's, the big rhinestone cowboy guy, is based off of this guy, Rex Cobble, who was basically this very, this rich man in Denton, very gaudy, very showy, had a lot of political influence as a business owner, and was very anti-weed. Like, publicly, like, marijuana is going to ruin our lives. And on the backside, he funded a marijuana smuggling operation. And that's where that story started. So it was a lot of research into that cowboy moth. And it's this, like, forgotten tale. I'm like, why haven't they made, like, a Netflix documentary or something about it? It's insane. There's this great story in Texas Monthly from the 80s that covered this, that I linked in my Substack, and where a lot of my research came from. But a lot of it was researching Rex Cobble and this cowboy mafia, and then also just the geographic location of obviously Galveston and High Island, so on and so forth. So that one, just because I hadn't been there and was doing this from a different time period, was one to research. Also, like, the narrator, who's unnamed, helps build out this highway. And during that time was when a lot of these, it was right after, a couple of years after the Highway Act of 1956. So just these massive highways to connect these very disparate and separate but very massive, spaces of the Texas cities was in full force. So they were hiring any and everyone who could basically go lay pavement. Right. And that was, Denton used to be very small at the time. And when that was connected to like Fort Worth, Dallas, and everything else, that it really blew up. Yeah. So that time was that was because I needed a time period. I was looking into sort of like the just mass expansion of Texas at the time. And obviously the character backstory. Right. American Girlfriend, for a similar reason, and to be fair, I didn't have to research Bangkok that much. And the only reason I did for location and like language and posterity, but I've spoken about this before, my dad's side of the family, we're expats. So my dad grew up in Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Thailand, and Hong Kong. And so there's a ton of family stories, of course, from my dad's side of the family's years in Southeast Asia. And a lot of the, parts of that story, the locations, for example, like when everything floods in that rainy season, they have to stick an extra tailpipe onto the car so that it doesn't drown.
Yeah.
And the tailpipe doesn't fill with water. That is a true thing. Like they have to stick basically like snorkels onto cars and locations. So that was stuff where I did research, but I had a lot of these moments and these little snippets from my family. And the other side of that was I had never been to Indiana. I had driven through Indiana, but I had never spent a lot of time in Indiana. Carmel was a place that I was fascinated by because it's I pulled the character from, again, like another one of these 90s news story things, this insurance magnate who had just this massive, when I say like this $30 million home, he owned like the biggest home in Indiana, which was, I think, outside of Carmel. And Carmel is a place that used to not have a lot and then has just experienced massive, massive growth and a very large influx of wealth in the past 20 years or so. And so researching that, and it's a suburb of Indianapolis. So researching that was fascinating. Again, this very like exodus from Chicago and the growth of wealth in the Midwest. So it becomes this sort of perfect storm of just excess and new build home developments, and it's great. And then I actually got to go to Carmel for the first time back in September. And I wrote American Girlfriend years ago. I wrote it, and it started out as a story called Indiana Hotter in 2020. And when one of my best friends from college is from there, she grew up outside of Chicago, but her parents moved there for a lot of reasons. It's actually pretty cheap to live there. It's beautiful. But she had her bridal shower and bachelorette there. And so I was like, I get to go to Carmel. I'm like the most excited person ever to go to Carmel, Indiana. Because I'm like, I got to figure out if I did this place justice.
Right.
And I hit it. I'm sorry, not to like, brag. I hit the nail on the head with Carmel, Indiana. And I was very happy years later that I'm like, I did it. I got the soul of Carmel, Indiana. It was fantastic. So a lot of that research went into Indiana and obviously the layout of that too. And also like just my fascination with Carmel, and then being, again, probably the most excited person ever to go to Carmel, Indiana from the East Coast for a bachelorette party. So
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. That's actually, I don't live that far from there, and I've been to Indiana a bunch of times, but I've never been. I might have to make a side trip one of these days.
Carmel is so fascinating because it's entirely, it's a lot of new build, but it's one of the like, it's very new build, but it's very like everything is sort of, it's hard to describe, built around this shopping center that is just a beautiful shop. As far as shopping centers go, quite beautiful. And then, there's this downtown area, which, again, it's very new build. It's very like, people would probably call it artificial because it's new and not built over time and very planned. But in terms of urban planning, it really works. And it was fun. I went for a run there one morning. And there's this giant rail trail that runs from like Indianapolis up to Carmel. And, I'm just running down the rail trail through Carmel and one development after another. And there's so many people out, and, it was fascinating. It was like, I highly recommend Carmel, Indiana, if you ever want to spend 24 hours or 48 hours in Indiana. So,
well, yeah, and there is a thing that I think, and maybe some people are sort of catching on to this, but people who live in East Coast or West Coast cities where the real estate is really, really expensive, you'd be surprised how far your dollar can go. I know my brother lived in California for a long time, and we both lived in Idaho together for a while. And he ended up quitting his job, moving back to Idaho, and it was sort of like the same amount he was paying for housing in the Bay Area. he basically was able to get a house about 4 times the size
Yeah.
for the same thing. Yeah.
Philadelphia is interesting because it is probably the last of like the major East Coast cities that is like relatively affordable.
Right.
And in fact, it is incredibly affordable. Like I live in South Philly, you know, not to brag here, like I have a normal job. I live in South Philly. I live in a nice neighborhood. I'm in a 1,000-square-foot row home. And what I pay for in, you know, rent, my sister I love her to death, she lives in New York, and she was living in Murray Hill. And what I paid for was, for my, you know, my old house and still my new house here, is about half of her monthly rent for a 3-bedroom apartment in Murray Hill. And so it's one of those, people complain about affordability, but Philly is like, and for different, you know, and for reasons, like Philly is not as safe as some cities. Philly, I am someone where I love Philadelphia, but I also hold it in full contempt of its failings, or full responsibility of its failings. You know, there are reasons why Philly has problems, and Philly does have problems.
Sure.
And so it's less expensive. And of course, like jobs, you know, paid kind of follows that. It's also just a cheaper city to live in. But, you know, at this day and age, like what you can get in Philly is so much more than like New York or Boston or anywhere. So
yeah, it's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about one other story that I quite loved. It might be my favorite in the collection, Utter Goodness, and that is the title story, Utter Goodness. I guess, and again, I don't want. There's so much joy in just reading it as it goes, and so I don't want to give away too much. But it got me thinking about a question that I think about sometimes, and that is, made me think of a moment about how to phrase this exactly. Why is America so religiously weird? And what I mean by that is, why do we have so many? We seem like we have a lot of religions that sort of start here or take hold here in a way that they couldn't where they're from. I mean, you spoke about, you went to the most Amish high school district in the country.
I lived in the most Amish county. Yeah, I am not Amish. I'm not Amish by trade at all. But I did not go in Rumspringa, but I'm familiar with the concept. I worked with the Amish. I worked at a dairy in college as well.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Very cool.
Anyways.
Yeah, so you know, and this isn't to say these sorts of things can't pop up in other places, but it strikes me that America seems to somehow encourage these pop-up religions. Not that Amish is a pop-up religion, but you know, your Utter Goodness is about effectively a cult. We have any number of cults running around the country at the same time, and then we have a bunch of, you know, religions that were formed here, upstate New York during the 1800s. It was like they were popping up all over the place.
The
Mormons are right, are a particularly American religion that is just growing every year. It's bigger in size and has more of the faithful. Do you have a sense of why that is? Like,
yes. Okay, you've probably unlocked, unfortunately, I'll go off, but one of my favorite conversation topics, which is like American Protestantism and why this happens. Because I think living across, I always joke, I've lived in Lancaster in Pennsylvania, and I've lived in Utah. I've lived in the 3 states with probably the most weird, totally American religious groups and religious sects, and of course then the most prohibitive liquor laws in the country, but which, you know, in this case, I'm like the Amish, the Mennonites, the Quakers, obviously the Mormons, and I am just very fascinated by religion and especially Protestantism, and I can't, you know, really loop Catholicism into this just because they're the one church and you know, don't have this same schism situation, and so, you know, when living around the Mormons, I'm utterly fascinated by the Mormons and the LDS Church, and I can go into that. That's an entirely different topic. And I also think too of like the Seventh-day Adventists, for example, and then because from, you know, that branched off, I think from a Methodist sect.
Yeah, I believe
and
that's right.
Then you get the Branch Davidians, who were an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists, and I think a reason that American, you know, these just hundreds, probably thousands of micro schisms and sects that have been able to exist in the U.S. probably due to freedom of speech laws and the fact that the United States has not historically prosecuted off of religion. Like if you think to pretty much anywhere else in the world, throughout history, either no free speech laws, or just if you had a different idea, you were just going to get absolutely, killed. I mean, even obviously I can't even jump into like non-Christian religions here, but even think of like the Troubles in Ireland, like that was in the Civil War, like that was, that waged on for years. And obviously there's still a ton of strife and contempt between Catholics and Protestants there. And, America, I think, because one, we don't have a history of prosecuting based on religion. Obviously, people at some points didn't like people who had different ideas religiously. The Mormons, again, an example of this, where Joseph Smith went out west. The Quakers were prosecuted at some points, but not to the same degree as we have in the past, couple hundred years. And America too also has prosecuted or hunted people out for their religion much less historically than any other country at any other time in history. And two, with free speech, you can say what you want about what you believe, and I think this is obviously fantastic. I'm a big supporter of this. And because of that means, hey, I don't totally agree with this one aspect of this church I'm in, which is chances are already a splinter from another church in this. Well, right. Intrinsically, yes, if you are a Protestant, you are a schism from the Catholic Church, but, way back when, but, I think that's especially why that breeds here, is that if you believe something, there's a chance or someone else probably agrees with you. And if you believe something that is a schism from or different from a religion that you're in, again, people also probably believe in that. So I think it's probably, I haven't looked as much into this, but that would be my off the top idea of why America has so many different different types of Christianity, almost all of which are splinters off from mainline Protestantism. Right. And I also am like very interested in like Protestant values and how that shaped the United States, especially early on. The Christopher Lash's Culture of Narcissism is one of my favorite books. Highly recommend reading it. It's and basically that goes into the like the idea of his argument of his book is like America had these much Protestant values in America of like humility and grace and hard work and this external community, where it used to be a lot stronger as well. And now that's kind of set over towards the me self. And so I think that's also been an interesting shift, and that shaped a lot of American religion in the past. I'd say like since the 20th century in particular. The shift of like the we to the me, the external to the internal, especially in Protestantism where God is, in Catholicism, you have the separation of like, okay, if you want to go talk to God, you got to talk to your father, and then you got to go talk to a bishop. Like there's a lot of that separation. And then in Protestantism, it's pretty much the sole, one of the sole things besides the Trinity that connects Protestantism is like, it's a relationship between you and God. And so I think that at the same time has reflexively sort of, fed into this new vein of American religion that is more about the self, not what you can do for God, what God can do for you as well. And so that's been fascinating too, but that is obviously, then I think that's also where like doomsday cults and stuff pick up, and prophets, if you will, and things that are very heretical in most churches, but also because we live in a country where you're not going to be prosecuted for your religion, and we have free speech. People will disagree with you, but you can still splinter off and have your cult. So
yeah. It's funny. There's a so I grew up Catholic. I was raised Catholic, and it's interesting to note that, and I'll just give a slight anecdote that it always kind of cracks me up. My daughter now goes to a Christian school, a sort of non-denominational Christian school. She really wanted to do this, and so we've encouraged it. And it's funny because her school is so small. Sometimes they share to have sports teams. They kind of team up with this Catholic school on the other side of town. And it's just hilarious to me that as like an Irish Catholic, I'm like, in my sort of family history, like you guys are supposed to try to kill each other. Like,
yeah, right.
And now you're like,
when I say the Troubles, you're like, oh yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And like these kids are playing on the same soccer team and they're buddies. There's something to me that's like a microcosm of how, generally speaking, I mean, I would say, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that the various American Christian sects more or less get along now.
They do.
Like, there's not a lot
And-
of friction. Yeah.
No, and I'll give my context here. I grew up non-denominational Christian. We went to church on Christmas, maybe Easter, at the Presbyterian church up the street, just because it was up the street.
Sure, yeah.
And so, but my family was not religious, and I did go to an Episcopalian high school. And I grew up non-religious. Like, I grew up saying I was agnostic. It just wasn't, I didn't have a spiritual life at all. And around after college, I started going to church. I started going to an Episcopalian church, mostly because it was what I knew. And I have been, and what I always say at the time, and I think something that Utter Goodness explores too, is having I didn't have a spiritual life, and I didn't have a relationship with God. And I'm not here to evangelize necessarily, but also, like, I think a lot of the characters in Utter Goodness are searching for something to fulfill that spiritual life, if you will. You have your cult, you have, in Utter Goodness, you have an American Girlfriend, you have this woman just searching for anything, and it turns out to be this old man. And I think that that's something, that lack of faith and that searching for some kind of faith. This is also like the thesis of almost the story in Sparkle Time, where there's this person who goes to a church, tries so hard not to believe, but can't help but believing. And at the time when I was starting to, find out what I believed in my faith, I was writing a lot about it, I think almost subconsciously for that reason. And I switched to an Anglo-Catholic church, and now I'm going to a Catholic church, and planning on converting, and which is really a, big moment for me. It took a couple years to figure out, and I'm still learning a lot, obviously. And I'm not also one of those people that wants to be like, oh yeah, I'm converting to Catholicism, because everyone is like, I had such a long, I went to so many 2-hour Anglo-Catholic, services, only for me to be like, I just agree with the Catholic parts. So, I went to so many, and that was also, I think, a really formative experience in learning about American religion and these different sects and how things splinter off. I mean, trying to explain what is Anglo-Catholicism, which was the church that I mainly went to for the past couple of years after I was like, I'm not sure I'm getting along with the Episcopalians very well. Was like, okay, that's a great, how do I explain Anglo-Catholicism in a way that makes sense and matters? And so that was, I think that was, at the time, I'm someone whose Christian faith has deeply grown over the past couple of years. But also, like, when I have more Catholic friends now, and I was always like, well, why don't we just all get along between, the Protestants and the Catholic? And obviously, yeah, we don't hold that same contempt of, like, the Protestants versus the Catholics. There's never been a moment in my life where anyone who's Catholic, when I say, like, oh, I'm going to Episcopalian Anglo-Catholic church, or I grew up Protestant, that they've been like, oh, I hate you. Like, right. That just doesn't happen. And, we may also, I think to now, where, like, I think of, like, I'm going to use Pentecostals as an example here, because they're also a fascinating sect to me in particular. And it's one of those things, people look at a lot of Pentecostals and they're like, these guys are insane. Right. They're very, like, traditional. But no one is like, man, like the Pentecost, and people will say, like, things are heretical, and I agree, like, certain things are heretical. The Mormon faith I do not agree with from a fundamental level, from a theological standpoint, but also, like, no one is, like, prosecuting the Mormons necessarily, or being like, I'm not going to be friends with a Mormon because they're Mormon. Like, that's just not necessarily something that I feel like happens on a large. No one's ostracizing a sect, or not, because they're that. So
yeah, it generally seems like in America we're all cool with whatever your religious beliefs are, as long as you can get along with the rest of us. Like, as long as you can like contribute to society and whatever, then we're fine with it. And then every once in a while, some group kind of goes off the rails on the sort of unspoken code that we're all participating in.
Yes,
and it's like,
Yeah,
but, like, oh, no, you can't do that, Yeah, but
yeah.
it's funny. I was just on a podcast. We were all talking about how much we actually culturally we like the Mormons. Just like
Oh,
every
I love
time-
the
yeah,
Mormons
they're great.
culturally.
Every
They're great.
Mormon I've ever met has been awesome. So it's
Yeah.
you know, yeah, it's very interesting. I am interested listening there to your sort of you talking about your personal faith and sort of how that has gone so far, because as I was reading Utter Goodness, there was a moment that struck me. I was like, oh, this is like Flannery O'Connor, but not with the sort of emphasis on the South. But there was, I guess, I don't have a really fine point here, but I did feel some common DNA with Flannery O'Connor, and I think partially because one of her, and she's one of my absolute favorite writers, so that's a high compliment. This notion of like grace coming through in these sort of unexpected moments, right? It doesn't necessarily look. It's not necessarily clean or easy or comfortable, but this notion of kind of grace pouring in through the cracks or something, I feel like is definitely there. And there is this, I think Flannery O'Connor even referred to her own work as something like Jesus haunted or something like that. At least that pursuit of trying to find God, or as you talked about in Sparkle Time, this notion of like almost not being able to give up on that, right? This sort of that position of that fascinating position from a literary standpoint of like almost wanting not to have belief and yet not being able to get away from it is an interesting conundrum for sure. There's I guess so. I want to move and talk about a couple of your some of your other stuff that you're doing, especially in your Substack, which Audrey's America, which is great. I've been poring over it this last week. And as we kind of move into this part of the conversation, just remind people, go get Utter Goodness.
The sequel, the upcoming sequel.
Right.
Utter Darkness. Wow,
Yeah.
just gave me the title for that.
That's not bad. So definitely people go check that out. farthestheaven.com, I believe it is. The links will be in the show notes as always. But on your Substack, you've got a bunch of interesting stuff, and I kind of wanted to start it with your most recent, I believe it's your most recent piece, on the controversial novel Stoner by John Williams. And I don't want you to necessarily give away, because you have some great insights in there, and so I don't want you to necessarily give all those away. I want people to read them, but maybe we can start with, why is Stoner so controversial? Like, I like it personally, but I'm not. It's not like a hill I'm willing to die on. I like it. If it's not for a person, that's fine. But it seems like every time it comes up, there's just like this pitched battle between different online personalities about it. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I went to a book club yesterday. I was talking about this because my friend Peter brought up the essay as well, and I think that it lies in its reputation and how it's marketed. And my friend Peter was talking about this too, where it's like when that book first kind of gained popularity online, I think it was around like 2015. It was after that second printing of the New York Review of Books copy. Was like there was so much just like almost stiflingly claustrophobic praise for Stoner. Like it was very like marketed and also written about as like a writer's, John Williams is a writer's writer. It's the best novel you've never heard of. It's this amazing, it is the American novel. Like these very high accolades, that were just very sort of parroted and repetitive. And of course, with any of that, we get a fabulous like revisiting, of what's the word I'm looking for? Retrospective on it. We're going through this right now, I think, with like Ocean Vuong, for example. He's a writer that I think was, again, sort of critically praised and was a product of his time, but now we're having like a pretty good and I think needed retrospective on. And I think Stoner has gone through like at least like 3 cycles of this now ever since. And I will give a quick opinion here that doesn't necessarily ruin my essay, and it's that I really like John Williams. Butcher's Crossing is one of my favorite books. I think Stoner is his least strong of his books, and I think it is an objectively good book. And I think that Williams is a very intentional and thoughtful writer. And a lot of he understands what he was doing when writing this in a way that I think when people call like There's a couple like reviews that say, or critiques of Stoner, and that they're like, Williams turns him into a martyr. Like, he wants you to be sympathetic and feel sorry for Stoner. And I don't necessarily agree that that's what Williams wants. And there's pretty good ways to tell that apart. So that being said, I think it is an objectively good book. It's not the greatest American novel. It's not the best, the greatest novel you haven't heard of, even though you've heard that phrase about it 16 times now.
Right.
But subjectively, I don't like it. I think it's more just personal gripes with it. I think that Stoner is a frustrating character. And that is a lot of what my essay is about, where I'm like, I like to divide books like subjectively and objectively when I talk about them, because I think that this is it's a great example of just stark realism. I think the characterization for such droll characters is fabulous. And Stoner's not a book that would make sense if it had a very like deep feeling of emotion to it. It wouldn't work. And
Right.
So I think it is a good objective book. On all of those technical points, you can check off, your list.
Yeah. No,
subjectively,
it's like the nicest cabinet you've ever. It's so
Yes.
well built. I mean, that's,
Exactly.
but you can not
Your
like
kitchen
it.
cabinet's fabulous, but
Right.
subjectively, it's a
but
kitchen
I don't
cabinet.
want them in my house. I don't want them in my house. Yeah.
I don't want those in my. That's not going to work in my kitchen.
Right.
So I think Stoner is divisive in one, because it's gone through a few of those retrospectives now. It's a you love it or a you hate it. I also, and this will connect back to what you first started this podcast with, which was about how Utter Goodness is marketed, or at least how we've like written about it on the back cover. And I think that Stoner has been disingenuously marketed, and as to a lot of books, I think. Like, how many novels can you think of now where it's like the blurb on the back is like effervescent and brilliant, and but it gives you actually no insight into what the book is about.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and then you read it and you're like, I don't know what that was. So it certainly wasn't effervescent. And I think that Stoner is an example of a book that has been
I was just thinking about Stoner being described as effervescent. I'm like,
Effervescent.
I don't even know what that means. Yeah.
Exactly. Glitter. And so I was very short story collections are hard to market because there's so many stories in them. And if you just say and I've tried to talk about the themes of it. And it's a lot to sum up on, a back cover of a book, but I think we pretty accurately got that. I always think to another book that has been accurately marketed as Antwerp by Roberto Bolaño. I have a copy of that somewhere, but that is a book that after reading it, I was staring over my bookshelf here, but that I was that was maybe one of the most accurately blurbed and marketed books that I've ever read, which it's marketed as Roberto or Bolaño's Big Bang. And that's a pretty high accolade for Bolaño, but and it's also 70, 80 pages long. So you're how is this going to be the Big Bang? It is the Big Bang. It basically encapsulates everything that Roberto Bolaño writes about in his, however many works he did after that in one, and it was his first book. So in one 70-page, very weird little novel. And, but I think that Stoner has been a victim of the New Yorker effervescent industrial complex, where it's just it's so, so over marketed in a way for what it is, and thus there's a lot of strong opinions based on that, and also because I think a lot of people do have. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have, a good view of Stoner. I think I take on sort of the neutral middle ground where I'm again, objectively great, subjectively, I want to throttle this guy by the neck and tell him to do something else. So,
right.
That's why I think people have strong feelings about it.
Yeah, there's a little bit of, I started, as I was thinking about this, I felt like there was a little bit of a similar flavor of the conflict as you'll often see in Catcher in the Rye. There's this sort of love-hate. We culturally have this kind of love-hate relationship with Catcher in the Rye. I feel like there's something similar there with Stoner. And maybe that does come from sort of the main character. Because a lot of people hate Catcher in the Rye because, a lot of people hate Catcher in the Rye because it's the one book somebody made them read. And so they're, right? And so, but and I kind of wonder too, it makes me think, you pointing out this sort of over-aggressive marketing. When Stoner came out and I first read Stoner, which was like around the time it came out in the reissue and New York Review Books, I was not online in the literary world at all. Like I wasn't on social media. I didn't read any, LitHub or I didn't go to any of that stuff. And I think I was just sort of recommended it by a friend. And so I think I managed to not be aware that it was being forced down everybody's throat in a certain way. And so I think if I would have felt that, I probably would have reacted to it more negatively. I thought it was like, oh, this like neat little book that I'd never heard of the author. This will be cool. And then
this is good. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
reading Stoner in a vacuum, I think would be like maybe one of the, given the scale of to what it's been marketed and its reputation. If you read, and like you said, people who have read Stoner with no idea of that background, I would be like, that's an entirely different like reading experience, I think, too. And I wonder if people who have done that, as you said, have this sort of like very strong feeling about it too. I like the idea of like reading very popular, very divisive books in a total vacuum.
Knowing
which, of course,
anything
is kind of
about
hard to happen when you're very online. Like, what if Catcher in the Rye is one of those books, and I've read Catcher probably. I did this thing as a kid where I read it once a year from like ages like 10 to 20. So I've read it like 10 times, probably 20 times almost, but more than 10 for sure. But basically a good metric for growing up is how well can you tolerate Holden Caulfield? Do you relate to him when you're 10? Yes. And do you hate him when you're 20? Also, yes. Right. So, but that was something too, where it's like, you read it, when you're 10, you're offline. It was 2009 for me. Like, and so reading that in a vacuum and then, obviously growing up and having more opinions on it and changing as you would from 10 to 20, it's an interesting book to read at different points in your life. And I wonder if Stoner would, because it is just also a book that covers this man's entire life. I also wonder if Stoner is one of those books where it's like, oh, if you read it every 10 years, do you have a different take on it? So I don't know.
I think so. I mean, I haven't read it since I read it in probably 17 or 18 or something like that. And yeah, that would be interesting. It's coming on a decade ago now, so I've been through a lot, so it would be interesting. But the one thing I am totally with you on, his other book, John Williams' other books are better.
They are. I will say I think John Williams is. I mean, I don't really know another writer who has like 3 books basically that has done such different subject matter for each one of them. Totally different.
Yeah,
he has a very good breadth of both subject matter and of course voice. And one of the reasons I really like Butcher's Crossing is because, one of the critiques of Stoner, which I think was intentional on Williams's part, is that you don't really, there's not a lot of feeling there. There's not a lot of depth. It doesn't, as marketed as it is, it doesn't really make you think of a world in a new way. And I think that Butcher's Crossing, when you just feel that despair of the guys getting stranded.
Oh my God.
For like the next several months, he does that despair so it's like gutting, and not in a way that feels like overwrought either. Right, but
very economical.
It's very good.
Yeah. I'm going to be talking about that. That's going to be a main episode on this podcast, I think, in March or maybe April.
Oh, awesome!
So, I'm looking forward to that. Talking with the writer Lake Markham about that. I wanted to also talk about another one of your Substack essays that I quite enjoyed, and let me make sure I'm getting the title right. You might be writing about yourself too much.
Yes.
It's sort of
controversial and brave.
Yeah. Right. I was fascinated by this, and partially because I have somewhat schizoid opinions about autofiction in general, and also I do think there is. I mean, this episode isn't about me and my writing or whatever, but it's the only thing I can bring to the table sometimes. I certainly feel like I personally evolved out of, I don't know if I'd call it a confessional mode, but I evolved out of writing about myself to taking bits and pieces of my life and experience and sort of scattering them around in a story that wasn't ostensibly about me in any way. But yeah, tell me a little bit about what was, I guess, the genesis of this piece? Why did you want to write a very thoughtful and in-depth piece that I think is very fair, but also I could see it ruffling a lot of feathers?
Yes, and it did, but in a way where I'm like that, it was inevitable. And I, opened the essay to that dialogue and critique. But so I guess for context too, and I talk about this a little bit in the essay, 27, I very much came of age in the like 2016 to 2022. Like I again, just like over onslaught of this confessional writing and these personal essays before autofiction was really coined as a thing. I very identity based writing, and it was something that as a woman and as a young woman at the time, when you see a lot of female writers, this is what they're writing about. And which the vast majority were, like Gia Tolentino, who I quote her essay about sort of this retrospective on that first wave of essays. She was a product of, and talks about it like she was a product of these very confessional, very vulnerable essays. And that's what she started out as. And so there was a lot of incentive to writing about yourself in your very vulnerable moments. And it's something I will say that I tried and I didn't do well. I'm not good at writing about myself. I don't like it. And there's also for me, I was like, why am I putting this like out into the world? And I think the, development of it was sort of like, has this really accomplished anything? A lot of these essays were not very good. It was more as earnest as they could be. It came sort of down to what was the point. But this is what felt very sort of overwhelming and suffocating, and specifically women's writing for the past, I'd say, decade. And a lot of it was your trauma will make you interesting, and is worth talking about and worth writing about, without sort of the, look into why we're saying, does your trauma make you interesting? If that's like, if your virtue is, you're traumatized, that's not really a virtue. That's not. And I think that, there's a lot of, incentives to putting out this work, and again, because of the volume of it. And it was sort of this also perfect storm where at the time, a lot of these internet publishers were shifting away from print. So clicks were a way to generate ad revenue, and these essays got a lot of clicks.
Yeah.
So that being said, that's sort of, I think, now evolved into more autofiction, and what I would call the Aniasins of Substack, this very Substack diary writing style. And I mentioned that in the very first paragraph, and I'm like, but here's why we're doing this. Right. So I have problems sometimes so there's sort of a twofold thing here. I think that a lot of women's writing is dismissed because critique is mistaken for misogyny. I'm going to sound very anti-feminist here, but I think that and the reason that a lot of these essays were able to be successful despite their lack of like merit, and despite them really having a purpose, was because to critique maybe not even the subject matter, but just how something was written, was sort of construed into misogyny. And I think that knee-jerk reaction, which has been the dominating narrative for women's writing and critique of women's writing for the past decade, has been just very detrimental. I think that, and so that's like the start of this. And obviously there are moments where the critique is misogynist,
Sure.
but there is a line between what's misogynist and what's actually viable critique, and criticism, but is getting called misogynistic or dismissed as such. And so I think that, and overall, I think that has been bad for women's writing, because I think now there's a lot of this, and this is sort of my retrospective, if you will, on this past decade of identity-driven and confessional writing. And two, I think that, we're in this era of autofiction, and I do not dislike autofiction. I think autofiction can be done very well. But there's also a lot of autofiction that is just dull. And a lot of writers that I don't, and this is not just women's based writing, but I think a lot of writers who, can't write about something besides their own lives, that may be projecting, but I think especially that, autofiction is just another version of this, era of confessional writing. And this being said, I think there's a lot of writers, and I'm not going to name names here, who are autofiction writers who probably can't come up with something else. which is going to be a hot take. Bear with me.
I agree with you.
Yeah, and they are good writers on a technical level. They can be good writers. Some are just not good writers. But my gripe, so it's one of those things where it's like, I don't dislike autofiction. I just want autofiction that is interesting and done well. And has maybe different subject matter than what we hear over and over and over again. So a lot of this essay was not, you might be writing about yourself too much, was not necessarily about autofiction, but about this like confession of the self. Again, are you writing this for yourself? Who is the audience? Is this good? Does this have, value, and does it add anything to this conversation? And then, how are you accepting the criticism of it? Every piece of writing is open to be critiqued and criticized. And a lot of the, the criticism of my essay was from the sort of crowd of like, well, you can't tell a woman that they can't write. And I'm like, so one, I'm a woman, so I don't know, I'm going to pull the woman card here. But also like, I'm not saying that woman can't write this, and I'm not saying that you can't publish it. But I'm also not saying that it should be, that it is just a completely like, you can't critique this writing. I think you should be able to. I don't think it's inherently misogynistic. And I think overall that attitude has been negative for women's writing for the past decade. I'm really happy we're moving past it now. I will say, I think something that, and there's an essay that I linked in that essay, I can't remember what it's about, but basically some of the differences between the sort of first wave of this confessional writing and now, is that one, the first wave was more earnest, and now it's this more like meta irony situation.
Right.
And also that, that first wave, there used to be this very like nice wrap up. I'm a survivor. I've fought. I'm strong. And now it's just, they sort of end in this like, so I'm in a state of despair. And I think I will say, I think a lot of people find this writing relatable, and that good for you. Good for you. But it doesn't mean it's good. And I think relatability and the ability for a writer to write something that is relatable is misconstrued as good a lot of the time.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of the criticism was, but I find this writing relatable. You can't tell a woman that they can't write. And I'm like, I'm not doing any of that in this essay. And I think that, as a woman, I open myself up to a lot of critique and criticism in my work. And I'm open to that. I've been in writing since I was 16. I will say I'm pretty hard-skinned to stuff at this point. I'm like, I'm forged in fire for this. But overall, I am someone who sort of, spent her tolerance on this attitude of what can we critique and what can we not critique? What can we have retrospective of and what can we not? Is this writing actually good? And so that was where that essay sort of started with. And, a lot, and that translates again a lot to my thoughts on autofiction. There was a great essay. I can pull it up. It was in the Drift, I believe. But about, I'm probably mixing up what it was in, but it was about, alt-lit is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And, a lot of the question of it was, that essay was, what is actually about alt-lit? And, because inherently there's nothing that makes autofiction about going through your day or, like going on dates, your sex life. There's nothing that makes that inherently alt. We've been writing about transgressive things like, sex or drugs or since like the beginning of time.
Yeah.
So what makes this inherently alt? Because it's really not.
Right. No, I'm with you on that. I mean, I don't really understand what alt-lit is supposed to mean, other than I guess it's sort of not published in the mainstream fashion. But to me, that's more like you're just talking about independent, like you're just saying it's independent.
You're just talking about independent writers,
like that. But yeah, the alt thing is never. Anytime I hear alt, what I expect to do is like open up a book, and it's like barely even going to be a book. It's going to be like, it's going to be
the weirdest thing you've ever read,
which could be great. But that's not usually when somebody says alt lit. It's usually like something like we're sort of talking about. You open it up, and it's like, oh yeah, Sylvia Plath did this 60 years ago. Okay.
Yeah. And I think too with, alt lit in particular, like, and you could group myself probably into it, but if anything, it's more of just a label that gets put onto this like current school of somewhat hyper online, which I don't think my writing is hyper online, but there's a lot of that, almost sort of sceney writing. And, that term started back in like the 2010s when alt-lit maybe meant that you were like an independent writer, and you were in this certain scene of, it was always like this certain scene of writers and publishers and, events and places. And it's a term that's been around for a really long time at this point, and serves less of a meaning in its label. Again, there's nothing really alternative about this as much as it is like, this is who's in it and this is sort of the vibe, if you will. It's just a vibe assessment.
Yeah. Well, I guess a vibe assessment is kind of fair too. I suppose,
I'll take it. But and I'm not opposed. I find it funny that this is like the term. I have nothing against alt-lit. I quite enjoy a lot of it.
Sure. Yeah, same here. I find that
I'm probably in it. Like
well, that's the thing I've wondered too, is like, am I in it? Because I don't.
Am I alt-lit? Wow.
I know a lot of people who apparently are. I don't know. I sometimes feel a little I feel like a little bit behind the times in terms of like the moment to moment sort of scene stuff, because I don't totally, like in this case, I don't totally understand what alt-lit is. I have a sense of it, but I wouldn't be able to just like instantly put a book in it or not in it off, maybe I don't know what the vibe is, I guess is my point. Yeah. I guess as we're kind of approaching wrapping up here, and I really have appreciated this conversation quite a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you the question I always ask new guests, and this is sort of trying to, get the audience maybe in touch with some books that they're not as familiar with. What are a couple of books, 2-3 books from the Audrey Lee personal canon? These are books that are significant to you, that are maybe, they don't have to be totally under the radar, but maybe you feel like they're a little bit under-regarded, but are important to you.
One is not a book, but a short story. And this is what I would call, my Big Bang, if you will. And it is the short story A&P by John Updike. Mm-hmm. And as I was exposed to this story in like my freshman year of high school English class, I'm sure if people have read it, that is probably also how they were exposed to it. And I've been a writer for pretty much my entire life. And my English teacher, my freshman English teacher in high school, we're still connected. I'm still friends with him. And this was the story where I was, up until this point, I'm 13, 14, whatever. I'm writing a lot of like genre stuff as like a 13 or 14-year-old does. And I'm moving more into just realism. And I've always been since then pretty much a realist writer. And reading A&P by John Updike, I read it and I was obsessed with it. I was like it's this short story about this grocery clerk in the 60s, and he's like a 19-year-old boy, 17 or 19-year-old boy, and he's watching these younger girls, he lives in a beach town, in like their swimsuits going through the grocery store. And it is somewhat pervy, it's sort of gross in its descriptions. And but it was one of those things where I was like, I really loved that story at the time and still do, because it was one of those things where I'm like, this is just, you feel like grody and awful reading it, but it's so it's like watching a car crash. And that I feel has fed itself into a lot of my writing, where I'm like, that was the piece where I'm like, you can write gross and you can write weird and you can write how people actually look at things. And it's not sanitized. And that is something that I think fed itself into the rest of my writing and still does, was literally that one short story. I highly recommend reading it. I love that short story so much. And I think it definitely was a pivotal moment in both as a reader and a writer of like, and then to be fair, this is not me saying I want to write gross and pervy stuff, but I don't, it's somewhat in a way, like a lot of my writing I think is more honest in that it can just be oddly grotesque. And one of the things that I always like to say, one of my friends, I don't write like sex scenes. I don't like writing about sex in writing. But one of my friends once said, your writing is like the horniest work without actual sex scenes, and you don't ever mention sex. And I was like, yeah, because I love this obsessive voice that I think also appears in A&P by John Updike. Mm-hmm. So that's one that's part of the Audrey personal canon. I would say the other one was one that came along a lot later in my life, only about maybe 2 years ago, and it was Airships by Barry Hannah.
Oh, yeah.
My friend Graham Irvin, who's also a writer here in Philly, it sent me, I think, the titular story in that collection, and that was one. And at that time, I had been, it was only like a year and a half ago. Most of the stories in Utter Goodness were written. I would say the vast majority that we included, maybe save for 3 or 4. And so when I read it, I was like, this is something that does feel very Audrey Lee in its sense of location in particular. And Airships is this it's came out like the early 60s, something like very mid-century.
I think the 60s, yeah.
Yeah, very mid-century, and it's very set in like small town Americana. And so I really loved Hannah's descriptions, in particular of place and how central that collection is also to place in America. So I would add that as well to the Audrey personal canon. It came again along a lot later in my life, but it was something where I felt it sort of affirmed in how it described place and again how that affects these characters. Again, I always say none of the stories in Utter Goodness could happen in a vacuum. None of the stories in Airships by Barry Hannah could occur in a vacuum.
Right.
Those would be the two. I'm looking over at my bookshelf here because those are the two that I really was like, that'll do it. But
no, those are great. And yeah, A&P is one of those interesting. I also read it as a freshman in high school.
Yeah.
It was pretty influential on me. I mean, I think maybe not as directly as it was for you, but yeah, there's still a couple images in there in that story that are in my head for sure.
They just stick with you. I went back. I'm sorry, I'm still staring at my bookshelf. I went back and read it more recently. And I was like, wow, this really found its way into my writing for about the next 12 years or so.
Yeah.
I've got a good one here. Let's maybe not necessarily as much in the canon, but Hunter S. Thompson, of course, I really love because of just sort of the insanity of the gonzo insanity of his work. And I have a copy of the Rum Diary of my bookshelf. And that's one that it's one of his only like truly fictional novels. And I mean, truly fictional is like, that's someone who autofiction works for, is Hunter S. Thompson.
Yes.
That is a good person for autofiction and good autofiction that exists.
Yeah.
And I love, it's very like, lip bro, but I love Hunter S. Thompson. He's just one of those ridiculous.
Well, he's a great character. He's a great character,
yes,
and the character is kind of grown bigger than the work, but the work is actually really freaking good. Yeah.
Incredible. And one of those, I don't think any movie that's been made from a Hunter S. Thompson book has really stood up to just the uninhibited, again, depravity and oddness of his work. But it's so entertaining. And he's such an American character. One of those things that the European mind could not comprehend is Hunter S. Thompson.
That's right.
So that's sort of, I almost feel like I can't say, I have to say Joan Didion in a way too, specifically slouching towards Bethlehem. I think she's just I love her essays, and especially the ones that entire collection is mostly rooted in Southern California in the 60s and 70s. My favorite essay by her is the woman's movement, but that's an entirely different story. But this collection in particular is so rooted in time and place and the characters there. So I think, and I don't, my Twitter name is John Didion, and I love Joan Didion. I really don't feel like I style myself after her, and my writing is certainly not styled after her, but she's also a person who so understands character and place, and something that I really love about her is she's not she has a good, and something that I do think I do is she has a good distance from it. She writes about herself there, but it's not about herself. It's about everything external occurring outside of her. She is just there, and she's not necessarily, in a way she's placing her judgment on it. It's sort of like in this, I'm going to go back to another part where it's like, if, I don't know, if I went to like the Ozarks and went to a Pentecostal church, I would feel like an anthropological, surveyor sort of, and she does that so well too. I really love her writing.
Yeah, she was brilliant.
And I especially love the stuff, like that when she's writing about 60s, 70s place and how she is just there. So
no, those are all great. Those are absolutely great recommendations. I guess anything else before we close? I mean, Utter Darkness. I said it again. What is going on with me?
Wow, you really new book
sorry.
announced. Oh my gosh. No, you're fine. You're fine.
Utter goodness. And your Substack and links to that stuff will be in the show notes. Anything else? I
Yeah.
mean, that's plenty
Yeah,
to promote.
I'll plug a few things. The Philadelphia reading for Utter Goodness launch party is January 22nd at Photo Lounge. That is on South 17th Street. I'm also reading with the fabulous writers John Pinto and Kevin Costello. Cool. Excuse me. And then we just are announcing the DC launch party, and it's going to be at Butterworth's on February 22nd, so
Awesome.
exactly a month later. I will be reading and paneling with fellow Farthest Heaven writers Tom Will and Anna Krivalopova. So
cool.
really looking forward to that one as well. And I think Bill's coming out for that one too, which will be really fun. So,
very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, absolutely, people, if you can at all make it to those events, do that. And buy Audrey's book, and definitely follow Farthest Heaven for, I know they got other stuff coming out this year. So, yeah, that's awesome. Well, Audrey, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brad.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had his bad. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had. He went down to the dope shop one Saturday night. He knew the lights would all be burning bright. Well, I guess he smoked a dozen pills or more. When he woke up, he was on a foreign shore. The Queen of Sheba was the first he met. She called him lovey-dovey and honey pet. She gave him a great big automobile with a diamond headlight and a golden wheel. Down in Honolulu, Willie fell in a trance, seeing the dusky beauties do the hula dance. His sweetie got in jail and Willie sure did shout when he got the news that she had wiggled out. He landed with a splash in the river Nile, riding on a sea-going crocodile. He winked at Cleopatra, she said, ain't he a sight? He said, how about a date for next Saturday night? He had 1,000,000 cattle and he had 1,000,000 sheep, had 1,000,000 vessels on the ocean deep, had $1,000,000 all in nickels and dimes. Well, he knew because he counted it 1,000 times. He landed in New York one evening late. He asked his sugar for an after date, started to kiss her and she started to pout when bang, bang, and the dope gave